Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Can you hear me okay? Everyone seems to be nodding, that's good. So I'm going to be talking about terminology, and particularly the question about whether we refer to people on the autism spectrum as having autism spectrum disorder or autism spectrum conditions, and does it really make a difference? It looks like a trivial difference, ASD versus ASC, just one letter difference, but is that difference important? But before I start, I just wanted to pay tribute to Lorna Wing, whose name is being given to this series of conferences and lectures organised by Research Autism. I'm of that generation where I can still remember Lorna being extremely active, going around the world, raising awareness about autism in the days when it really needed a lot of awareness raising. I think her book, called The Autistic Spectrum, probably changed the way we think about autism by introducing the concept of the spectrum, when previously we used to think of it categorically. She was one of the founding parents of the National Autistic Society, long before they had their big beautiful building in City Road, when they were in Willesden, just in a small house, just a handful of parents like herself who founded the National Autistic Society in the living room of a small house. So I'm very pleased to be talking in a conference in her name, and I wish that she was well enough to be here tonight, this morning. So let's talk about this question of disorder versus condition. I'm starting with definitions. How do we define disorder? How do we define condition? So if you just look at the dictionary definition of the word disorder, it means lack of order, or lack of any intelligible pattern. And in mathematics and physics, disorder also has a very specific meaning randomness. So is this really the kind of term that we want to use to describe people with autism? Obviously in medicine it's used widely, but usually to mean that something is broken or dysfunctional, or referring to a disease. And again, because the concept of the spectrum of autism is so wide, we have to sort of raise questions about whether it's an appropriate word to use. In contrast, the definition of the word condition, I think, is more neutral. The word condition, the definition literally means that it's a state of being. So we might use the word condition as in what were the social conditions that gave rise to the recession, or what is the condition of your health, which doesn't make any assumptions about whether it's good or bad. It's just asking what is the state of it. So the word condition, I think, is a much more neutral word. But what are the pros and cons of the current terminology? So the international language is ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder. And the people that defend the use of ASD do so because they say it implies that there's a certain severity, that the person needs this diagnosis because their symptoms are so severe that it is a disorder, and that kind of signals severity and suffering. And certainly if you look at some characteristics of people on the autistic spectrum, like epilepsy, self-injury, lack of language, gastrointestinal pain, or arguably even general learning difficulties or below average intelligence, it's true that all of these things can severely impair the person's capacity to function and to have anything that resembles a good quality of life. They can do. So you might argue that it's justified to talk about disorder. So that's in defense of the term ASD. But against that, and I think this is where my critique comes in, most people on the autistic spectrum don't have those features. So it's a bit unclear what percentage of people on the autistic spectrum do have, for example, epilepsy, but it may be a minority. The same is true about mutism or lack of language, etc. It used to be said that half of the people on the autistic spectrum had general learning difficulties, but actually some recent studies are suggesting it's actually a minority. It's not as many as a half. That the majority of people nowadays getting that diagnosis have at least average intelligence, if not above average intelligence. So it's not clear that there's anything that's necessarily, anything in their makeup that's necessarily like a disease. I think that the term disorder, as I've said, it implies that something may be broken in their mind or their brain. I find the term quite harsh or stigmatizing. So if you have to diagnose someone and say, you have a disorder, I think that's quite a tough thing to tell the person. Whereas if you tell them you have a medical condition, I think there's something a bit gentler about the term. And I think, what I want to show you is that if you look at the neurobiology of autism, so what's going on in the brain, even in genetics, and look at the psychology of autism, there's not a lot of evidence for dysfunction, but there's really a lot of evidence simply that people on the spectrum are different. So not necessarily dysfunctional, but just different. So if we look at the term condition, autism spectrum condition, what are the pros, what's the argument in favour of using this term? Well, I think the term condition, because we use it in medicine a lot, this medical condition, that medical condition, it still signals that the person has a medical condition, that they wouldn't have the diagnosis unless it was disabling in some way. So it recognises the disability element, and it certainly signals that the person has some vulnerability. But as I've already implied, I think that the term condition is less hard-hitting to say I have a condition rather than I am disordered. I think it's more respectful. I think it still includes the notion of a range of severity. So I'm not persuaded that you need the word disorder to indicate severity. Conditions can come in a variety of levels of severity too. But I think the term condition also makes space for, it acknowledges that there may be deficits, psychological deficits in autism, but there may also be assets or areas of strength, and that the person may just be processing information differently. They may have a different cognitive style. So for all these reasons, I think the term condition carries fewer value judgments, it's more neutral, and I was trying to, on the way here, think of what are the cons, what are the arguments against using the word condition. I couldn't think of any, so if any of you have any, I'd be happy to hear them later. So the real question is, why have we sort of got the term disorder? Why did we inherit it? Well, it comes from DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So those of you who are clinicians know that we have to use this. This is what's published by the American Psychiatric Association, DSM. And DSM loves the word disorder. So it is a manual, a classification system, and it just has hundreds of disorders named in there. These are just some examples. So if you have difficulties with reading, in the States, you're said to have reading disorder. We might say dyslexia, or we might just say this child has difficulties with reading. But in the States, you'd be said to have a reading disorder. If you find maths difficult, you're told by DSM that you have a mathematics disorder. If you're a stubborn kind of person, you get diagnosed as having oppositional defiant disorder. If you're feeling depressed, it's very common. Instead of just calling it depression, they call it major depressive disorder. I think you're getting the message. This is my favorite one. If you have anger issues, there's a new diagnosis called intermittent explosive disorder. These are all, in the international classification system, but they love to use the word disorder. The main reason they do it is because in the US, you can't get medical insurance unless you're diagnosed as having a disorder of some kind. These are the various different editions of DSM. DSM 2, 3, 4. We're currently using 4. This is the sort of revised 4th edition, and we're going to be going into the 5th edition next year. But the point is, medical conditions are not set in stone. They're defined by committees of people who write this book in the American Psychiatric Association. And in some ways they're quite arbitrary. So if you look at how many disorders were in each edition, back in DSM-1, the first edition, 1952, it recognized there were 106 ways that your mind could be disordered. If you go through the various editions, it's been growing year on year, so they're adding more and more disorders. So by the time we got to DSM-4, which is the version we use at the moment, there are 3 times as many disorders as there were back in the 1950s. In other words, they keep inventing new disorders that we can be diagnosed with. You can see at various points they not just add them, but they delete them. So in the 1980 version, DSM-3, they deleted homosexuality, which used to be a disorder, because of the political lobby saying different sexual orientations don't necessarily imply disorder. They deleted neurosis as a disorder, which used to be there in 1987. You know that next year they're planning to delete Asperger's. So it's a sort of arbitrary system, loosely based on evidence, but actually it's under a lot of debate. And if we go to the current version of DSM-4, we have this category called pervasive developmental disorder. This is where the autism spectrum is meant to sit. I don't really like the term pervasive developmental disorder either, because I don't think it's pervasive, but that's the way DSM classifies things. And what we used to call autism, and that's basically what Kanner called it in the 1940s, for some reason the Americans renamed it autistic disorder. You know, why did they need to add that word disorder when we had a perfectly good word, which was called autism? And the term Asperger's syndrome, which Lorna Wing, I think, really made popular and made people aware of in her article in 1981, the Americans call Asperger's disorder. So we had a perfectly good word, Asperger's syndrome, and they've renamed it Asperger's disorder. So that's sort of just kind of examining the terminology, but let's look at, you know, whether the science justifies the term disorder. Well, if you look at the science, let's start with the brain. This is a picture of the amygdala over here, and in this study, everyone has 2 of them, one on each side of the brain. The amygdala is seen as smaller in people with autism compared to a typical brain. So it's showing a difference in size, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is in some way broken or disordered. It's just showing a difference in size in this particular structure. And we can look at other structures. This is the corpus callosum, this white area in the center of the brain that connects the 2 hemispheres. There's a lot of studies which show that that's smaller in autism compared to a typical brain, that particular region. But there's nothing in the evidence which says that that means it's worse or disordered or dysfunctional. We're simply seeing a difference in size. You know that when you look at brains, you can either look at structure, which those last 2 slides did, or you can look at function, how the brain is working. So this is showing you patterns of brain activity whilst the person is looking at faces, having a brain scan. So it's looking at blood flow, and here's the autism group, and here's the control group, whilst they're looking at faces. And what you can immediately see is that there's an absence of any activity in the frontal lobe whilst they're looking at faces. So there's a difference in how the autistic brain, if we can call it that, is responding to looking at a face. But where is it in the evidence that says that one is better or worse than the other? They're just different. Equally, we can look at development. So there's now a theory which is gaining a lot of interest, which is that in autism the brain is growing too fast in early development, so it's called early brain overgrowth. And we can see this if you measure head circumference, just putting a tape measure around the child's head from the youngest age, from birth through to teens. In blue is the sort of typical head size for the 50th percentile, so the average child. And in red are children with autism whose head circumference seems to be larger than a typical child. So we're seeing a difference in size of the brain, or size of the head, but is that a sign that it's better or worse? It's just a difference. And at post-mortem, what people have found is in the green area, which is frontal cortex, if you look at the number of nerve cells in the brain, so neurons, just simply count them, there are 65% more nerve cells in the autistic brain than in a typical brain. So they've got more neurons, more nerve cells, but again, I don't see that as telling us that it's better or worse. The brain is developing very differently. You can also look at not just measuring the head with a tape measure, but you can look at grey and white matter with age. So these are typical brains in blue, and basically what you're seeing is in grey matter, the autistic brain is showing greater volume at every age. So the brain is growing faster, but growing more grey matter. This is age 12 through to 60, so it's just taking people who've had 2 brain scans and just plotting these 2 points. And this is the same thing in white matter. You can see that the red line is the autism group, that white matter is the connections between regions in the brain, that there's more white matter and the brain is growing faster at each stage in development. So we're seeing differences in how the autistic brain is developing. This is a brain scan showing how the brain responds when they hear an unexpected noise. So imagine you're lying in the scanner and suddenly there's a bleep, and what the scientists are looking for is which part of the brain responds when you hear an unexpected sound. And basically what's found is that in the autism group there's a greater response in the auditory cortex, even to a very small sound, suggesting that they're more sensitive to sounds, that they have a bigger response in the brain to sounds. But again, is that a sign of disorder or dysfunction? It's just a difference. And finally, on the biology, just to give you a flavour of genetics, you can look at how genes are expressed in the brain, and here what they've done is taken, at post-mortem, taken brains from typical individuals, people with autism, and looked in 2 regions of the brain at how genes are expressed. And over here you can see there were 510 genes that were expressed. Here there were only 8 in the autism group. So there's a difference in the number of genes being expressed in different parts of the brain. But again, this doesn't tell us whether it's better or worse. So the biology, I think, is quite neutral in terms of saying not everyone develops in the same way, but is not putting a value judgment on what is better or what is worse. Equally, let's now look at the psychology. This is quite a famous study by Amy Klin, who was at Yale at the time, showing that if you show people with autism a movie, this was Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and there's Elizabeth Taylor, and you simply track the viewer's eyes, so what are they looking at? A typical person will be looking at the eyes of the actor, and people with autism tend to look more at the mouth of the actor. So this is showing us that they're processing faces differently. Is it better to look at the eyes or better to look at the mouth? What we're just seeing is a difference. And if they're not looking at faces, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what are people with autism looking at? And these 2 images, I think, sum up quite well what we typically see in a child with autism, that they may not be making eye contact, they may not be paying attention to other people, but they're usually very engrossed in something, and it kind of goes with the diagnosis that they get obsessed with things. So here we've got a child who's obsessed with Lego. Here's a child who's obsessed with water and how water is flowing and what happens when he tries to break the flow of water with his hands. But are these things necessarily a sign of a disease or a disorder? What we've actually got is in both cases, I would argue, children doing intelligent things, trying to understand patterns in bricks, trying to understand patterns in water. They may not be looking at people, and that may be, we react to that, we find that uncomfortable, but the child may be doing something that is different, spending much more time focused on objects, focused on things, but nevertheless possibly doing something intelligent with it. This is a slide that comes from Karen Pierce, who's a scientist at the University of San Diego in California. What she found was that at the earliest age you can diagnose autism, which was about 2 years old. The best way to discriminate a child with autism from a typical child was the amount of time they spent looking at an object or a face. So here's the autism group, and basically they're spending, the colours aren't coming out very well here, but if you put a line across the slide, you can see that this line would be, if you're above the line, you're spending more time looking at the object. If you're below the line, you're spending more time looking at the face. So you've got a lot of kids with autism looking at the object, whereas look at that line over here, this is the typical group. There's really only one child looking at the object, most of them are looking at the face. And this is a group of children with developmental delay who are also spending more time looking at faces than objects. So all this is telling us is the best way to do early diagnosis from a behavioural point of view is to measure how much time do they look at faces or objects. But nothing in that statement implies that you shouldn't be looking at objects. It's in some way a sign of disease, because looking at objects can help you understand at least the physical world, the world of things, even if it's not helping you understand the world of people. We know from people with autism that when adults who are high functioning fill out questionnaires, they are also not just interested in objects, but interested in systems, things that are highly systematic. So this is a weather barometer, this is a car engine, this is a library of books that's been classified systematically, and things that are systematic follow patterns or follow rules, and people with autism seem to have a strong preference for systems, systematic information. And you can see here that they endorse interest in systems at a much higher level than a typical group. And to my mind, that's not a negative. Being interested in systems and how systems work could be a great asset in the right environment. We asked children with Asperger's syndrome if they could figure out how this system worked. It's a little mechanical system where the wheel goes round and you have to say whether this point P, what will happen to it. It's a multiple choice little physics test. The correct answer is it will move back and forth. And you can see that children with Asperger's syndrome perform better on this test than a control group. These are 13-year-olds. So a focus on things rather than faces and a focus on systems can actually have a spin-off in terms of being able to solve these little mechanical reasoning tasks at a higher level. So despite having a diagnosis, they're actually performing at a higher level. So where is the disorder in that? Here's a quote from Hans Asperger himself. So working in Vienna in the 1940s, he wrote in German obviously, but this is a translation into English by Uta Frith. What he said was, for success in science, a dash of autism is essential. So he's taking something very positive, science, and saying if you want to be a good scientist, it helps if you've got a bit of autism. And that was just his observation, his clinical observation, because his view of people with autism were that they were actually very logical, very systematic, and that those are the qualities that you need to be a good scientist. And that idea was picked up by Ian James, who's a fellow of the Royal Society here in London, arguing that if you look at the biographies of these two early physicists, Newton and Cavendish, they fitted, their profile fitted a diagnosis of autism. Isaac Newton, Henry Cavendish. Newton discovered gravity, Cavendish discovered hydrogen, but if you looked at their biographies, they fitted the profile of autism. And equally, if you looked at these 4 Nobel Prize winners from the early part of the last century, Einstein, who discovered relativity, Marie Curie, who discovered radium, her daughter, Irene Joliot-Curie, who discovered nuclear fission, and then Paul Dirac, whose name is just getting a bit lost there, who was at Cambridge and discovered quantum mechanics. He said if you read their biographies, they would all have had a diagnosis of autism today. So there's obviously dangers of looking at biographies and trying to sort of diagnose people who aren't alive, but let's just look at one of them, Albert Einstein. He said as an adult, "I do not socialize because it would distract me from my work." So he was just really focused on his work, on understanding the universe, the physics of it, but not really people and relationships. The dangers of relying on biographies are obviously that the people are not here to talk for themselves, and that biographies can be very fragmented, so they may not be accurate. We've been looking at scientists who are actually living, where you can get better information. So we looked at mathematicians in Cambridge, and first of all looked at students of mathematics to see what percentage of them have autism. And you can see a higher percentage of students in mathematics have autism compared to students in other disciplines. We also looked at students in mathematics who gave them this measure called autistic traits, a measure the AQ, a measure of the number of autistic traits you have. People with autism tend to score very high on this, obviously, but you can see that mathematicians and scientists score midway to the general population. So scientists don't, as a group, have autism, but they may have more autistic traits than people in the general population. This was a study of the fathers of children with autism. Over 1,000 fathers took part to look at what their occupation was. What we found was that a disproportionate number of fathers of children with autism work in engineering compared to fathers of a control group. So if you assume that one or both parents of a child with autism are carrying the genes for autism, and you go back to the earlier generation, you don't necessarily see autism, but what you might see is a talent at understanding things, understanding systems, which is obviously what's needed in engineering. This led us to test a particular prediction, which is that maybe you should expect the rate of autism to be higher in places like Silicon Valley, where there are parents who are working there because they are talented at understanding systems, whether it's computer systems or IT particularly. And this was an idea floated in Wired magazine back in 2001. So what we did, just finishing up so I don't overrun, was not go to Silicon Valley in California, which is full of people who are talented in understanding systems, but go to a Silicon Valley closer to home, which is in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, there's a city called Eindhoven, and that is the sort of IT hub of the Netherlands. About 30% of the jobs in Eindhoven are in the IT sector, and that's because the Philips factory has been there since the 1890s, so for over 100 years it's been attracting people to work there who are talented at understanding systems. And we looked at 2 other cities in Holland, Utrecht and Haarlem, just because they were matched for size and for other variables, to see what was the rate of autism in these 3 Dutch cities. What you can see is that in Eindhoven, which is the IT hub of Holland, autism was more than twice as common than in the other 2 cities. So this is leading to the possibility, still just a hypothesis, that autism is linked to genes for talent at understanding systems, whether it's informational systems or mechanical systems or mathematical systems. There may be a genetic link, but that's not telling us that autism is a disorder or a disease. It's simply telling us that it's somehow related to talent. I want to finish with a picture here of Gary McKinnon. His parents are here today, and many of you know that Gary got very focused on things rather than people, and used his computer skills to hack into the Pentagon, and then faced extradition with the American government putting a lot of pressure on the British government to hand him over to stand trial in the US. Thankfully, after a 10-year fight by Janice and her team, the British government had the good sense to not hand him over. And their argument was that this was a man who was obsessed, that's the nature of Asperger's syndrome, obsessed with things. He was obsessed with finding out what was in the American government's computers, but he wasn't a criminal, he wasn't a terrorist, he wasn't dangerous. He was doing this from his bedroom in North London, just because he was trying to get information that he believed was in the public good. Most of us would realise it was a stupid thing to do, that we might get arrested, we might get caught. His Asperger's syndrome meant that he wasn't really thinking about how he might be perceived. Indeed, he left little notes on the Pentagon computers saying, your security is very poor. So he wasn't even trying to hide what he was doing. The fact that he did it in 2001, is that right, Janice? Just after 9/11, wasn't the best timing. But again, he wasn't really thinking about the social implications or the way he would be perceived. He was just over-focused on things. So if we look at his story, what we see is a person who was talented at using computers. He could break into the Pentagon. Focused on things rather than people. Clearly a man who was vulnerable, and that's why he needed the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, so that it could be used in the criminal justice system to help his defence, and so that he can be guided to use his skills in more productive ways. But I don't think there's anything about either him or people on the autistic spectrum that convinces me that we should say that they have a disorder. So I'll stop there. Thank you.